All right, thank everyone for coming to this morning's program, Sanctuary at Fort Ontario, the story of America's only World War II emergency refugee shelter. My name is Aaron Noble. I'm the Senior Curator and Historian for Political, Military, and Governmental History here at the New York State Museum, and I will be moderating the conversation, the Q&A afterwards. We are thrilled to be joined by our panelists for what I'm sure will be a fascinating conversation about this important story in not only New York State, but American history. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, today's program is being offered to New York State teachers for CTLE credit. If there are any educators in the audience today, please make sure to sign up on the clipboard on the table at the entrance to ensure that you receive your credit. This program is also being filmed and will be placed on the museum website for educators to participate in asynchronous CTLE credit. We are excited to be able to announce that the first 6 educators to sign up will receive a free book from the Safe Haven Museum gift shop that were generously donated by a friend of the New York State Museum, Mary Beth Sullivan. Following the program, I also encourage you to visit the museum's display about Fort Ontario Holocaust to Haven in Metropolis Hall on the east side, direct all the way across the lobby of the museum. And finally, this afternoon at 1 p.m., please join us for a family-friendly celebration of Lunar New Year. Enjoy a special story time featuring Lunar New Year traditions, followed by an engaging tour of the Tuck High Company with senior historian and curator Ashley Hopkins Benton. Explore this historic Chinatown shop, learn about its rich history, and discover how 3 generations of the Lee family served their local community. This program is also on the east side of the museum, just around the corner from Holocaust to Haven. Now to our program, I'm excited to introduce our panelists. Originally from Waterford Half Moon, Paul Lear is an historian and historical archaeologist with 4 decades of experience in historic site administration and cultural resource management. He served as Historic Site Manager of Fort Ontario State Historic Site for New York State Parks from September 1999 to June of 2024, and earlier as an Interpretive Programs Assistant from 1986 to 1992. He was a founding member of the board of the Safe Haven Museum and Education Center in Oswego, and in 2002 he helped open and maintain the museum in the old Army Guardhouse that interprets the history and historical significance of the World War II Fort Ontario Emergency Relief Shelter. Since retiring, he rejoined that museum board and supervises staff and events. He speaks and writes on the history and historical significance of the World War II Fort Ontario Emergency Refugee Shelter. Paul was co-chair of a committee to coordinate a 3-year National Park Service study to determine Fort Ontario's eligibility to become a unit of the National Park Service. This led to a bill soon to be introduced in the Senate and Congress by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and Congresswoman Claudia Tenney to establish the Fort Ontario Holocaust Refugee Shelter National Historic Park, administered by the National Park Service on 4 former Army buildings and 2.5 acres. Paul holds an MS in Public Archaeology from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, a BA in Anthropology from SUNY Albany, and an Associates in Liberal Arts from Hudson Valley Community College. He is married to Anne Marie Lear, who owns and operates Man in the Moon Candles in the city of Oswego, and received the State Parks Maple Leaf Award for Outstanding Leadership in the Field in 2023. And next, after a professional career as a news reporter, editor, and college professor, Anne Callahan Allen retired from teaching in the Department of Communication and Film Studies at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York. She returned to her hometown of Oswego, where she rediscovered the story of the Fort Ontario Emergency Relief Shelter and decided to take a fresh look at that event from the perspective of the Oswegonians who lived during that time. Through her research and writing, she found that many people from all parts of the city worked to integrate the refugees into all aspects of community life. Holocaust Refugees in Oswego from Nazi Europe to Lake Ontario, published in March of 2024 by the History Press, reveals individual stories of the impact of the refugees and Oswegonians had on one another during that period and throughout the course of their lives. Each of us, our panelists, will give a brief presentation, and we'll conclude the program with a conversation and question and answer session with all of you. Again, thank you all for attending. And I will just leave you guys here with a short video that the museum has produced, and then Paul will come and begin his talk.
Thanks, Aaron. Oh, that's Man in the Moon candies, not candles. No one cares about candles. All righty. Thanks for having me, and thank you, family, friends, and everyone here today. Okay, it's good to be back home where I spent a formative year of my career in 1985 and 86, okay, with the archaeology unit here. Okay. So we all have a connection, obviously, to the Holocaust, and mine is my family, my mother and father on the left. I'm a product of a mixed marriage, right? Army, Navy. My mother, oh boy, she enlisted. My father, he waited for Uncle Sam and got drafted. That's him in the middle. He carried messages, Signal Corps. My Uncle Syke, iron worker. He worked combat engineer, fought through North Africa, Sicily, and saw extensive combat. Okay, so my father, of course, would tell some of his war stories, very few, but then he went on, by orders, he went through concentration camp, as ordered by General Eisenhower. All right. Eisenhower's famous description of the camp at Ohrdorf. He wanted to make sure that every soldier in theater got to see what they were fighting against. All right? And my father he would not talk about what he saw. It was just too horrible to discuss. Okay. So, Fort Ontario. I knew little about it when I went up there to work in 1986. I knew enough about snow. I ran out the door and got a four-wheel drive Bronco up at Jack Burns in Mechanicville. Okay, it's a very lengthy history, a complicated place. British and Army post in French-Indian War to 1946. 5 battles, French-Indian War, 1812. Veterans housing after the war. Now part of it is New York State Historic Site that you see. The city has part of it. That's going to become a national park, the part they own. Port Authority of Oswego has part of it now. It's a National Register District. It was FDR's favorite camp, all right? And it's the only camp for Holocaust victims, mostly Jewish, in World War II. And that's what I ran for 25 years, the old stone fort. All right. How it appeared in 1944. Sorry, both are blurry. Almost 200 buildings there. It's a special unit post by the end of World War II. It's where the Harlem Hellfighters were trained, became from infantry to anti-aircraft artillery. First time blacks got a chance at a technical field in the Army is at Fort Ontario. Okay, that's all the buildings constructed for them that our refugees lived in later. All right. Roosevelt decides he's going to open a shelter for Holocaust victims from Europe. It's a project of the War Refugee Board. We're the first country to have a refugee policy. And it's to relieve Allied supply lines in Italy, which we're occupying because refugees were crowding the roads, making it difficult for our military to engage and to fight the Germans. But what very important was, it was to prove to the Allies and the Nazis that the United States was serious about providing rescue and relief to the Jews of Europe. In the end, the War Refugee Board saved about 150,000 bribes, getting people through the lines. But as John Pele described it, too little, too late, but it was an effort. And one of Roosevelt's reasons, of course, was to help the 1,000 refugees that were selected to come to Fort Ontario. Why only 1,000? Politics. The country and Congress very much anti-refugee, anti-Semitic. He was able to do this with his war powers to bring over 1,000. Any more would have been too far above the radar. He picks Fort Ontario, which has instantly criticized his choice of opening a shelter because of Congress and people with similar views. But it's praised by the Jewish community and other Americans who have more open viewpoint on refugees and Jews. All right. How does Oswego react? Committee of local people, foremost citizens, get together and send a telegraph within an hour of this announcement that no one knew was coming, that they were thanking him for the honor of bringing refugees and establishing the camp at Fort Ontario, and they pledged full support and tried to get everything ready for them. Right? But again, why Fort Ontario? Well, it goes back to FDR, 1913. He writes a master's speech, why the U.S. should prepare for war during peacetime. World War I's on the horizon. No one's listening to him. He knows we're going to be dragged into it, but he establishes military policy at Oswego, dedicating a park where a fort was that Montcalm and the French came. They captured everything in Oswego. The lesson was the British and the colonials had all the great resources, never worked together, and so the French have an advantage the first few years of war. They take Oswego, Fort William Henry, Last of the Mohicans, and Ticonderoga. So that's important. And then 1929 and 31, he's governor of New York State. He goes on a 2-week tour every year of National Guard camps. He comes to Fort Ontario to review his favorite regiment, Teddy Roosevelt's regiment, all right? The 258th New York Field Artillery. There he is in his car, reviewing the troops. So when they give him a list of recently abandoned army posts, he sees Fort Ontario. Fort Ontario is my camp. I know its history very well. It's an excellent place. Okay? And Henry Morgenthau, Secretary-Treasurer, goes, yes, very nice with a very nice climate. Well, these guys only came north in summertime in July. Oswego's paradise for like 3 or 4 months, So, okay. So they got to get this army camp built for, 1,800 soldiers, turn into apartments for families and individuals. But it's wartime. They work quickly to convert these things, make apartments and whatever, because you're dealing with 108 or so men in a building. There's only one bathroom at either end, so they need women's rooms, need men's rooms. So big rush. They had to establish criteria. They had some staff in Italy. These are what they were looking for. And notice no separation of family groups. Fort Ontario, besides becoming the only camp for Holocaust victims, is the birthplace of U.S. refugee policy. It's the first time refugees are brought into the U.S. outside the 1924 immigration quota. It sets the mark for refugees from then till now. People fleeing communism in the 50s and 60s, Vietnam in the 70s, Cuba boat lift, Mariel, right up to today. Okay. So you can study refugee populations in camps or whatever. Everything happened at Fort Ontario first. Okay. Age, these are the ages and sex. There's one issue you're going to find with the refugee shelter. They're trying to avoid bringing men of military age. They do that. So a lot of older men and a lot of kids. And guys like me, my age, we don't do too well at hauling coal, and stuff. Because they're going to have to work. These are citizenship. 18 countries, 23 languages. You talk about a hodgepodge of people. All these people that got through German lines, across the Adriatic, into Italy. So that's what's different about this group of refugees. They're not cohesive. There's no unity, and there's all different factions and groups. Okay. They're looking for skills, just like we look for refugees or immigrants today. But a wide range of skills, but people, no plumbers or carpenters or laborers, people who could physically run a camp. Okay? There's one flaw in the plan to establish this refugee shelter at Fort Ontario. You got chemists, scientists, doctors. They also thought that doctors can work the hospital at the camp. Well, they couldn't because you have to have a New York State license. So they didn't think about these sort of things. Okay? Nowadays, when refugees come into a town, say Springfield, Ohio, the government's all there with different programs for them. Okay, that wasn't there. Okay, here's their experiences fleeing to get there. Many were in concentration camps early in the war and got out, tortured, persecuted. Some have been hidden by the church in Italy. There's a few exceptions to this 1,000 people, and some White Russians got in. The last minute, the 4 or 5 men choosing refugees stuck a few other people in there. Of course, you know, when you go on a trip or something with a group, and some people don't show up, you know, health issues, things like that. They described a few people that they could, brought them in. So people who got out of Russia in the late teens and 20s, to, you know, loyal to the Tsar, ended up in this group. Just a few. Okay. Major stipulations: they have to go back to Europe at the end of the war. They all signed papers. Of course, the language of some of these papers isn't clear. You know, must or may, I can, I may, and they brought in as guests. Guest implies, you know, you're not going to have to work this camp. So there's no mention of that to these people when they're brought over. All right. They gather at Naples at the harbor. They get on a troop ship, the Henry Gibbons. They're mixed with another group of American wounded soldiers coming back together. And, of course, they all get along great. The refugees, some are very talented, musicians, singers. They do plays and skits. They have a great relationship on the trip over. Of course, anybody who's heard tales of troop ships like my father was on, you know, 4-tiered bunks, everybody's seasick, and this happened there. One of the refugees, a young girl, 8, 9 months, Rachel Montiel, these kids, refugees, are all malnourished. She gets sick, gets a fever. She dies on the ship just before they get to New York Harbor. She's buried at Riverside Cemetery in Oswego with 12 other refugees who died at the camp. The other thing about the ship, it's not like a cruise ship. There's no place to sit down, which maddening. Okay? Certain people are very important in the history of the shelter. Ruth Gruber, the most. She has a PhD. Henry Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, hires her as someone who can work with them to get to know them. Who are these people? We've got people like Lewis Corn, former War Refugee Board guy, or WRA guy, administration. Okay, Edward Marks. They're great at working with these people, but she speaks Yiddish, German, a couple other languages. She gets her stories. So while she's on this ship, she gets to know them, and that helps them when they bring these 1,000 refugees to Fort Ontario. Captain Corn and Marks had experience working at Japanese American camps. Fort Ontario was run by the War Relocation Authority because they ran the Japanese American camps. The War Refugee Board only works in Europe. So the camp is run with WRB policies by another administration, and the WRA wanted these people to not have a camp but to go to sponsor families, but because of Roosevelt's original stipulations, they could not do that. Right? They get to New York City, they get deloused, DDT. Their clothes are in bad shape to begin with. The chemicals just do a number on them. They take a couple Army ferries over to Hoboken, the big railroad terminal. Right away, there's an issue, a good issue. One of the MPs recognizes his father-in-law. So, oh yeah, we've got a lobbying group already here, because maybe over 50, almost 100 families between there of refugees have family in the United States, all right, who are going to be for them and lobbying for them. Okay, so they got an overnight trains, day coaches, get to Fort Ontario around 7:30, and setting up. Local workers from the factory gather, city residents leave their houses, they gather at the fence, barbed wire, chain link fence right there. They're still on the train. They're just getting ready to get off the train. And they start unloading, and they start the customs processing. And the kids are the first ones, because they're uninhibited. They get together, they meet, go to this fence, and start talking with the local Oswego kids. You know, they start, associating, all right? So the fence becomes a very significant artifact in this story of the shelter. It's where people gather, local residents and refugees. But the kids are the first ones to do it. Okay? They go through customs processing, cardboard boxes, just everything tied together. You can really see when these close-ups of how bad, a few of them had anything. Homemade sandals, threadbare clothes. This kid on the left, a couple of the customs officials see the kid and they buy him shoes. All right, they go out, they get a pair of shoes for him because shoes were they had homemade sandals they made in Italy. They were falling apart. But these are in pretty poor shape. This is the first day they're coming in. Right. The second day, Dylan S. Meyer, head of the War Relocation Authority, gathers the refugees over by the ball fields, and they tell them how things are going to be. And he says, from now on, whenever there's a knock on your door, it will be a friendly one. Okay, because these people had been in concentration camps, on the run, different world. Okay. So the media shows up. All right. Holocaust stories were buried in the back pages of newspapers, magazines for years. All right, always in the back. Fort Ontario results in these stories going to the front page. Alfred Eisenstadt, the famous Life magazine photographer, the end of the war, the sailor and the woman kissing, Times Square, that guy. He does a great article. Newspapers from around the country come here to Fort Ontario to document this thing. Well, these reporters get a story they can sink their teeth in. They get it because they start interviewing people. Now they understand. Okay, foreign press is here. The majority of the refugees were from Yugoslavia. All right, so their press is here. Okay, but the golden era of the fence begins, and what that means is, well, the refugees are trapped, stuck in the shelter, in the camp, for a month, while they study, see if anyone has any bad diseases. So they start to gather at this fence. And people start talking. And I grew up around here, and my mother's from Waterville, the Aluns, and you got the Russian church, the Irish church, you got the French church up in Cohoes. Everyone's speaking languages. And Oswego, of course, at that time, same thing. So they're trying out their languages. Lifelong friendships are made, passing things over the fence. So, very iconic figure. And you'll see that fence in the exhibit here at the museum at Fort Ontario. And the Holocaust Museum in Washington, there's a whole gallery on the Fort Ontario Emergency Refugee Shelter. And we loan them a section of that fence. So, East 9th Street there. All right. Rumors start up. All right. About these refugees. No one can really see. They're living in luxury, that type of thing. So they got all the cigarettes. They got all the turkey at Thanksgiving. They're crazy stuff. So the local newspaper editor, Waterbury, another great figure, these people who engaged positively with the shelter. Okay, we're going to put all these rumors in the paper and disprove them. It worked. He figured the better things people are going to say about the refugees are going to come out, and sure enough, they were the majority of public opinion. But they have the open house at the end of that period. All right, and so now you can see how these people are actually living. Homemade, 2x4 bunks or whatever, army cots, things put together, very primitive. This is an interior image by one of the Lehman family. And then after 30 days, they can have passes. You can leave the shelter for 6 hours, maybe a little longer if you're going to a movie, because movies went till midnight. All right, but about 5,000 people came into Oswego through the shelter that day. Now, some problems developed pretty quick. People have relationships and we want to get married. So, well, how are we going to do this? And so you can't leave the camp, but they got the licenses from the city and they got married right on what's now the ball field. You literally walk in the footsteps of history at Fort Ontario. You know, it is our only actual Holocaust site in the United States. We could take these photographs and go on walking tours of where Manya and Ernst got married. In our museum, we have artifacts now from these refugees, and that's Manya's veil from that day. Of course, the other thing happens is people get pregnant, and so what do you do with these babies? Are they citizens or not? I think I've heard something about this in the news lately. Okay, 23 board, and Justice Department, you know, government, they won't say if they are or not until everything shuts down. Okay, and then the other thing is a lot of these people have kids in the military, you know, like, and they want to join the military, but they can't because of their status. There's one of the families with their son, and some of the mothers or whatever, whose kids are in the military. It's from one of the scrapbooks of one of the refugees. So in this open house, you get to see the interiors. The Albrecht family, top left and bottom. Another family interior. They weren't just families. Single men and women came over. Orphans came over. All right, it's a real mixed population. All right, this is the old Army barracks, big red brick ones. You see an Army post. That's where the single men were staying. All right. Eleanor Roosevelt comes to visit. From early on the 30s, she's a big advocate for refugees. Fights and fights. The State Department, where Breckinridge Long is trying to stop any refugees come in, and she always going to FDR trying to help. And there she comes to Fort Ontario with Eleanor Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasurer's wife. Okay, the man on the right, that's Joseph Smart, the director. He's handpicked by Meyer to run this camp. Very good administrator, very pro-refugee. So she comes for a day, writes in her My Day column, she writes about the shelter and the refugees and to help them. Now, these people from Europe, we have to feed them. They've been starving. All right, the cost estimates are way too low. It costs more to feed them, 59 cents a day. Start hoarding and gorging right away. Dry cereal in Europe, that's animal fodder. So a lot of adjustments. The bread, you know, they used to have dark bread, so they had to make, you know, instead of white bread, one little girl, refugee girl goes, "Is this cake?" You know? So they're trying to fortify everyone, especially the kids. They're pumping them full of milk, right? 20s to 30s, they start to understand what vitamins do. So very important. But you got 18 national cooking styles, you know. So you have these mess halls they're putting these people in. It's one of the mess halls they're converted. And of course, now they're going to try to get religious practices back. They've lost all this. So they set up kosher kitchen. Okay, they have to go to the Army mess facilities. They put hot plates in the apartments, but they couldn't put stoves in because they burned the place down. Right? Because it's pretty primitive. Well, there's no insulation in these buildings either. Should have pointed that out in those interior photos. And if you know about Oswego, you're experiencing the weather we have right now. We're on that lake with the wind howling over. We're cold, and everything's individual coal stoves. Medical care, the government only provides the very basics. Dental care, all right, here. Now, these people are supposed to be free of disease, but these men in Italy who chose them, oh, you've got a heart condition, we think they deliberately sent people to Oswego to make sure they got treated. So a lot of the regulations, they just bypassed them to help these people. So for the first time in years of being on the run, they're getting eye care and dental care and medical care. And as we get older, foot care. Right? Clothing, they're in rags. They need clothing, there's shortages. Shoes especially, they get grants. The clothing is people. There's that kid, again, that on his shoe on the left or whatever, sandal, it's just in rags, the sole's coming off. Right? Better close-up. All these committees are helping out. In the beginning, people or groups are trying to help out their own interest group. Say you want to help out the Poles because you're a Polish organization. A Oswego committee had to form, another one to help regulate that, to distribute it fairly and evenly. Security, the Army says, these people are great, we don't need security. 6 weeks after they open, here, there's a local police force run by the Sheriff's Department, and they're the ones who check people in and out and help out if people need to go to appointments, okay? The only photo I've ever found of the interior of the guardhouse, which is now the museum building, and that's where they check people in and out. Here's one of the high school students. That's one of the passes. So you have to stay within city limits until July 1945. That's when they go 25 miles out. That's when the War Refugee Board is disintegrated, goes away, and the WRA alone runs everything. Once again, they try to get sponsor families, but unsuccessful. They won't let them. Education, right off the bat, Catholic bishop says, these kids are going to school. Superintendent Riley from the public school comes in. We're sending these kids to schools. Eleanor Roosevelt arranges for them to go to the college. Right? The adults get intense English instruction. So, busy place before they open. This is the adult education. Some of the kids become excellent students, right? Because they're hungry for education, which they've been deprived for years. Pets, okay? You haven't had pets, cats and dogs. And Fort was always a great place for stray dogs anyway, because the Army cooks always fed them. The refugees go crazy for pets, but they don't license them, so they have to bring in the licensing unit to take care of them. I put this in, of course, another reason, Springfield, Ohio, where they had the crazy rumors about eating dogs and cats and stuff. And so this is my take on pets, cats and dogs here. I think I did something on Spectrum about a month ago, too, when that was on the rage. And Betty Morgan Bowen, she's a Quaker, Society of Friends. That's one of the groups brought in, help out. They run summer programs and things. She writes a book, Milo, and he has a dog, Bubby. And controversial, it's a runaway dog, and he has to give him back to the owner, eventually gives him back to him. But shows how important pets were to the shelter. Also, baseball is figured as the American game. The kids want to become Americanized, they learn how to play baseball. Okay. Right. Aged private support, this is nursery school, okay, that it's organized by outside groups. Okay. Different organizations, National Refugee Service, prominent, Hebrew Shelter and Immigration. These are just a few of the groups that helped out. Libraries for the books and medical care they're paying for. They're paying refugees to engage in culture education projects. Okay, they got a newspaper. The Boy Scouts come in. There's Harold Clark. They got a Boy Scout group. Okay, religious care, very important. 2 synagogues are established, okay? The special holiday food they pay for. A mikveh, okay? They set up the ritual bath for women. And the poor shelter director, a mikveh? Yeah, a mikveh, yeah. It's got to have water, okay. Natural water, okay. All water's naturally goes. No. It can't come from a pipe. It's got to be from the air, or whatever, this or that. And he doesn't get it. He finally rings up his hand and points at 2 engineers. You give the rabbi whatever he wants. So years later, Marx writes, in his 90s, he writes his biography. He says, and we probably established the only mikveh the Army ever built. It's a wonder if it's still there. Okay. These are religions, the chapel, non-denominational chapel, that becomes one of the synagogues. The other one is not standing anymore. Here is the interior of that building. That building is now in Buffalo. It's a black Seventh-day Adventist church. It still stands. They moved it after the war. It's really cool. It's one of the refugee paintings, Mikhailov, one of those Russians, Olga Mikhailov. Did a bunch of great paintings. Right. Vocational training, beauty culture for the women. They love it. They also do overseas refugee training. They do things like carpentry and things like that. And the guys try to take that on, but it's kind of like teaching me all that stuff. So that didn't really. At least one man became a carpenter, but again, they're older guys. They're not really going to catch on. Roosevelt's death has profound impact on these refugees. he said they had to go home, but he's been their savior so far. They worship him, and he dies. What's going to happen? They don't know this new Truman president. Okay. Meantime, the Friends and other groups, summer activities. The kids get out of school, they got to do something. They kept them busy. And this photo on the right, bottom left, is girl curly hair. Okay, that's Doris Schechter. She's one of the refugees. She becomes a restaurateur in New York City, author of books. She comes up for reunions and things like that. Okay? Refugees work at the fort. They can't work outside the post, which drives everybody crazy. They need workers outside. Because of potential competition, they're not allowed to. All right? And they're not paid very much. But they have to work. And this is Max Sipser, is an Austrian caricature artist. Does incredible stuff. So, English, important. Now, we have the scrapbook of one of the teachers, Mrs. O'Reilly. She wrote comments on all her pupils, and Mrs. Scherzer was a German housewife. That was her comment: not up to others in class, no education in her own country, a problem child. So, different evaluations. So, there's some great artifacts. That first winter was horrible. The smart director said, these people, we can't survive here. This is where these people are living. For 25 or 30 or 35 years, I wouldn't go out there in winter, outside my car, when you keep it plowed. No insulation out there. Also, that first winter, we know how the media is. You lose interest fast. So they're out there hung out to dry or freeze. Okay, there. Okay. And they realize they have no future. We're in this camp, but we can't go anywhere. We can't move on with our lives. Then you have a couple tragic events. Caroline Blyer is very depressed. She's got 2 kids in Europe with her first husband. She's worried about them, what happened. Got 2 kids with a current husband at the fort. And she takes 100 pills, aspirin, walks out, supposed to go to theater, and freezes to death. So that upset everyone in the camp. Because whenever you have refugee camp, or you deal with psychological forces, all right, people get very depressed. So it's one of the first things you learn about a camp like this. And so she's buried at Riverside. But then Arpad Buchel, he's a guy in his early 40s. He's got his kids there, his wife, his family. He's a hard worker. His mother's there as well. She's got a heart condition. They're out shoveling coal. He fills in for someone. It's a February day. The sun's out. He's digging and digging. It collapses on top of him and suffocates him. So they start doing investigations on labor conditions. And he's buried at the Orthodox Cemetery in Janesville. His mother dies a few months later, right, of heart attack. Okay, the psychologist makes determinations, but the government doesn't do anything about it, really. Okay, but in the meantime, these are very active, creative people. They always keep doing, and they have plays and things, and great musicians. Charles Abeleys is an Austrian conductor. They have great names for different clubs. Okay. There's Max Sipser, the artist. They have a big arts and crafts festival. Brucker wins it. Miriam Sommerberg is there. That's her bust of Joseph Smart, the director. All right. But they have this festival. There's Smart. There's the 2 versions of his bust. They bring everything down to Syracuse for a big art show, but they're not allowed to go visit. 30, 35 miles away, they're not allowed to go be at their own another art show. But these are the conditions. They're living in a prison. A camp is a prison. You have a wire fence around it. You can only leave for 6 hours a day. You have to think about that as a camp, as a prison. They can't get on with their lives. By the way, those 2 busts, they're both at the museum now. The oldest son donated the first one. It took him a couple of years to finally come through, and the youngest son gave the plaster cast one, the test, to the museum. They're both there. Orphans, very difficult. A bunch of orphan kids. They don't know what happened to their families. They're there on their own. The Weinstein kids, like they're the only ones, they find out after the war that their mother's still alive, okay? The war in Europe ends. They're supposed to go back. What's going to happen? They can't be as joyous as everyone else. You know, a lot of them, they have no homes to return to. Their families are murdered. You know, they had their properties destroyed, or their neighbors are in it. After the war, there's a couple million people running out, displaced persons all over. Their former neighbors, for Jewish refugees or people who try to return home, they're killed by their neighbors. That's the world in Europe after the war ends. And a lot of people in Congress want to send them back. All right. Joseph Smart is upset. He resigns as director, forms a committee to lobby to stop this. A lot of prominent individuals, Eleanor Roosevelt, are involved. He sends a statement to Truman asking for them to be set free. And the WRA and other agencies try to let them go, or at least send them to their families, or find sponsor families. One of the Sipser caricatures. The House Subcommittee under Congressman Dickstein comes up, interviews everybody. You know, they think this is going to lead to something. Here's the Boy Scouts refugees are testifying. Here's the Boy Scouts. They do the pledge. They say, want to be Americans. We'll join the Army. We'll do this. And how do you say no to a Boy Scout who says that, wants to be an American? But nothing happens. All right. Summer goes on. Another investigation, much more serious, with more evil intent in September. And some of these got nasty guys interviewing the refugees. It's clear when you read through the transcriptions. Rebecca Erbelding, the nation's top Holocaust historian, is working on a book on the shelter that will be published in 2027, I believe, or 26. And she's really gone in depth on these refugees. She found out just how serious it was for sending them back. Jetta Hendel, here's how she responded to, going back. No, I don't want to return to the country from where my parents were deported, where my life was reduced to such a disgrace. Okay, it ends up her parents were murdered at Jasenovac camp, and they weren't really gassing people there. There's supposed to be their weapon of murder is one of the thatch cutters for wheat, in a brutal way, in Croatia, this camp was. But it's her words. That was her response to these congressmen. Sipser does this great thing. Here's when they first get there. Now he does one a year later showing on the shore of Lake Ontario, there's the fence, the lake, our lighthouse, and he puts them both together. A year later, we still don't know what's going on. Freedom seems to be further away through the telescope. Very iconic image here from the shelter. Okay. So, interesting thing, the fall of 45, things have turned. Refugees are now getting clothing drives going. They're sending clothes to all these displaced people. They're becoming Americanized. They're really getting things together and helping others. So things have changed. Some of the refugees from Yugoslavia go back, though, because they get frustrated. Right? But December 22nd, Truman gives them a gift. The Army says, why are we going to bring these people to Europe when we're just going to send them back on their own visa quotas and things like that? So Truman basically says they can come here, they can stay in the United States if they want to, and get their freedom here in the United States. So Truman becomes the hero. But now you got to get these people processed and out. That takes 3, 4, 5 months to do this. But it's the American tempo. All these refugees have become Americanized. They're moving fast. When they first got there, they're hanging out in cafes and sipping their coffee for hours and hours. It drives a single merchants crazy. But now, all these kids who business school are typing up the forms. The Boy Scouts are helping with photographs. They're doing the fingerprints, working with officials when they come here. Okay. They have to be resettled. The National Refugee Service and other groups come in, Catholic groups for the 90 or so Catholics, and they get the paperwork done. And then they go back. And they have to go to Canada at Niagara Falls to get processed, but all the paperwork is done. So it would take hours and hours in a day, but they just do their oath and sign everything and go. That's the Canadian consulate. It's over the Rainbow Bridge. And that section of movie that Aaron showed, that's really a 13-minute video. A few years ago, I saw a newspaper article that mentioned over the Rainbow Bridge, a film. What the heck is this? We knew from that section that Aaron showed that there's more to this. I couldn't find it anywhere, but then I contacted Rebecca Erbel at the Holocaust Museum. She got her film curator on it. He tracked it down at Pennsylvania Historical Society. They wouldn't give it to the Holocaust Museum. When Ken Burns did his special, she had Ken Burns call him up. Did it for him. Now everyone has Over the Rainbow Bridge. If you get on Google, internet, you can watch it. Fascinating. Over the Rainbow Bridge. All right? Okay. Here's where they go, all over the country. All right? One of the families getting together. New York City's the big mecca. A lot of these refugees are from the garment industry. Like my family came here from England to work, the garments, the mills and things here. The Lears, anyway. Okay. Now, 1981, a movement starts at the fort. They dedicate a monument to the refugees and other victims of Holocaust, millions of them. Ruth Gruber comes up. In 1983, she publishes her book. That really kicks in. It's an incredible book. You want to learn about the shelter, you read this. The State Museum, Norma Ball's fired up. She does the permanent exhibit on the shelter here. Norma in the museum understands the historical significance, how unique Fort Ontario, the shelter, is. Okay? And Ruth is relentless for years. She died a few years ago. She was like age 103. All right? Here's 1983. They come back. More reunions they start. Okay? The monument itself gets vandalized in 82. Someone tries to pick out Jewish. That's the only time anything's ever happened. But now it leads to Charles Kuralt, Sunday morning shows, videos, and now we're on the verge of becoming a National Historical Park. It's important that we have a National Historic Site so people can come and find out that the Holocaust was real. It's the truth. We're living in an age of deniers now, just like Eisenhower warned us against. Things my parents, my uncles all fought against. They're going now. That's significant. It's important to have a historic site where the proof is there. It happened with all these people's stories. So that leads to the museum being opened in 2002. Right? I was there for the beginning and came back to open the museum and then wrap it up. And you come visit. We're open now in the winter from Thursday through Sunday, 11 to about 4. All right? These are some of the books you might want to read on it. Okay. There you go. How did I do?
Well, first of all, thanks to Kat Morehouse for working to organize and promote this event. Thank you, Aaron, for agreeing to moderate the discussion. I have to admit, it's a little intimidating to follow Paul. I mean, Paul is a true historian. Full disclosure, I was an English major. So, I'm living amongst the historians here. But being an English major actually instilled in me a lifelong love of people stories. So my part in this is to share just a few of the people stories from what I believe, and that Paul has alluded to this as well, is probably one of the most unique historic sites in this country, the Fort Ontario Emergency Refugee Shelter. And it's certainly fitting, obviously, that we're here on the eve of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and with the theme this year of Holocaust Remembrance and Education for Dignity and Human Rights. It's a fitting theme because we need to remember, and we certainly need to continue to educate. And I feel that stories are very powerful tools to do just that. So the book that I wrote, I hope, is a small contribution to remembering and to educating. Wachsan Shire, who was a Somali British writer and poet, wrote a book called Home. And in that book, she said this about refugees. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. Now, there is a powerful metaphor. See, I told you I was an English major. No one wants to be a refugee. It's a label that's forced on you. You have no choice. Either you escape the mouth of the shark or your life is over. The question is, where do you go? And certainly you want a place of safety, security, ultimately of opportunity. And for millions of people around the world, in the decades since its founding, the United States has been that place. And for the 982 refugees of the Nazi Holocaust who were brought to Fort Ontario during World War II, Oswego was that place. So this is going to look familiar. But this is what it was like on August 5th, 1944. Oswego's suddenly in the national spotlight, and many members of the National Press Corps converged on the city because this was their chance to see the first victims of Nazi persecution on U.S. soil. But excitement was growing in Oswego as well. And even though not everybody was happy about the arrival of those foreigners, by the time the train pulled in near the fort, dozens of Oswego refugees gathered to meet them. And yes, they were separated by this high wire fence, but that fence had bordered the fort property for years. And that didn't stop the Oswegonians. Interactions began almost immediately. What I found was that a lot had been written about the refugees themselves, and rightly so. I mean, their survival stories were dramatic. The contributions many of them made post-war to this country were invaluable. But for 18 months, while they lived at the fort, they experienced the transition from horror to opportunity with the thoughtful and careful support of many individuals in Oswego. Now, I'm a native Oswegonian, so I'm a little prejudiced, and I'm not saying Oswego was a perfect community. Some people did resent the presence of the refugees in their midst, particularly people who had loved ones fighting and putting their lives at risk far from home. Some people, in fact, more, I think, feared for their economic well-being because memories of the deprivation of the Great Depression were still fresh in their minds. But I found in the research that I did that so many more decided to extend what support they could to these fellow human beings who had really suffered so much. And the more I read about it, the more I asked myself, why was the Oswego experience, by and large, a success when there is so much division and fear still present in communities that are experiencing an influx of refugees today? Why did it work in Oswego? And are there lessons that moment in history can deliver for communities that are grappling with the refugee issue today? So a lot of people have written about the shelter. And one author, Miriam Badami, wrote about the shelter, and she said this about Oswego. She said, Oswego at that time represented all that is possible in a community, all that is open-hearted in ourselves, as long as we keep the door to our souls open. So the book that I wrote is about the Oswegonians and the refugees who lived together in that singular open-hearted community that kept the door to its soul open. And what I'd like you to do today is to introduce you to just a few of the Oswegonians who provided, through gestures small and large, that transition from horror to opportunity for the shelter residents. So that's the restaurant owner, Charles Gagas, on the left. He was a native of Turkey, and he emigrated to the United States from Greece in 1913 and subsequently moved to Oswego with his wife and their 5 children in 1925. Charles Gaggis, during the war years, owned and managed the Home Dairy Cafeteria. It was on the main street on the west side of Oswego. And once the fort shelter residents were able to get passes and leave the fort and go into town, the Home Dairy Cafeteria became a gathering place for them. Charles Gaggis remembered what it was like when he came first to the United States, and so he welcomed the shelter residents to his restaurant. And in that building, he had built a mezzanine area, and that's where the refugees would gather to drink coffee, chit-chat, trade gossip, to enjoy a normal community life, a life they had not known in years. And Charles Gaggis made room for them. He knew they didn't have a lot of money, probably much more than the money for a cup of coffee, but he made room for them and he welcomed them just the same. So I was able to talk with Charles's son, Chris Gaggis, and Charles's daughter, Elaine Gaggis-Cost. And one of the things they told me was that their father's kindness was rewarded many times by the wonderful singing talents of some of the people who gathered there, that they would often, both of them remembered, they worked in the restaurant as teenagers, these people breaking into song and entertaining the other customers of the Home Dairy Cafeteria. And Elaine, who is the taller young woman on the right, was in high school at the time. And Leah Hamp, who was one of the fort residents, actually became one of Elaine's best friends. And they're pictured there at the fort. The businessman, that's Ralph Shapiro of the Shapiro Paper and Confectionery Company. He actually later served as Oswego's mayor. And he was likely the first Oswegonian the refugees met when the train arrived near the fort. Ralph Shapiro could speak Yiddish, and so when the refugees were afraid to disembark at first because they saw this large fence topped with barbed wire, Ralph Shapiro got on the train, spoke to them, and assured them that the fence was there because the fort had been used for military training for years. But to allay their fears, he suggested a couple of the refugees come with him into the fort shelter to inspect their new home, which they did. And once convinced that this was not another camp like those they had experienced in Europe, people got off the train and confidently entered the fort grounds. And Ralph Shapiro would continue to provide support and friendship for the shelter residents throughout their stay in Oswego. And in fact, Ralph Shapiro and his family welcomed them for visits to their home. And I found out many Oswegonians did that. I mean, Paul mentioned the Thanksgiving dinners. And, you know, I know a lot has been made of the fence surrounding the fort. It did scare them the refugees, when they first saw it. But once they realized it wasn't erected for them to confine them, it did become, as Paul talked about and showed you all these pictures of, a real gathering place for their first encounters with American citizens. In fact, while they were still quarantined in mid-August of 1944, Shelter Director Joseph Smart spoke to a meeting of the Oswego Rotary Club, and he talked about the people of Oswego and their demonstration, he said, of the traditional American sympathy for the underdog. The fence surrounding the fort, facing East 9th Street, is thronged each evening, he said, with local citizens eager to make friends with the Europeans and make them welcome here. So for me, the fence really was far more of a uniter than a divider. And there was the barber, Jimmy Scandora. He owned and operated Jimmy's Oak Hill Barbershop on the east side of Oswego. One of his customers was Harry Lasky, who was president of the local Netherland Dairy. And Harry Lasky told Jimmy Scandora, you know, the shelter needs a barber. And Lasky volunteered to donate a barber chair if Scandora would provide the barber services. And so Jimmy Scandora would close his barbershop at the end of each workday and head to the fort, where he provided barber services to the shelter residents, and he did this faithfully until the shelter closed. Then there were the teachers. Oswego's educators at all levels were instrumental in the integration of the refugees with their American counterparts. This is Ralph Faust. He was principal of the high school then. He cut his summer vacation short because he wanted to interview the high school eligible students to be sure to place them in appropriate classes before the start of school in September. And he was aware many of them had not been in school for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. He was also a fierce advocate for these young people, and so were his faculty members. They worked to ensure that the shelter residents were able to catch up on all those years of missed schooling. And this enabled them, many of them, to pursue advanced degrees and go on to make valuable contributions to a wide variety of businesses and to communities across the United States. One of those faculty members was Thomas Crabtree. He was the industrial arts teacher at the high school, and he was remembered with great fondness by the shelter students he taught. And despite the restrictions on travel beyond Oswego, Thomas Crabtree basically said, the heck with that, and he piled a group of young men in his car, and he drove them to Syracuse because he wanted them to see American industry at work. So they visited plants, saw amazing, for that time, mechanical equipment operating, and some of them decided, they said right then and there, to become engineers. One of the refugee shelter residents, Edward Levitch, wrote about Thomas Crabtree in later years in his memoir. And he remembered that Crabtree predicted a post-war building boom. Eddie Levitch apparently took that prediction to heart, and in 1960 he founded what is today Levitch Architects and Builders, a 3-generation business in Berkeley, California. And I have not been to Berkeley, California, but I've seen their website. That is a very, very healthy business. Edward Levitch, well, it's in California too, passed away a year ago, February, just shy of his 100th birthday. This is Dr. Seward Salisbury. He taught at the college. He was part of a team also that organized a series of lectures for shelter residents called the Culture of America. So each week, a guest expert would provide information to shelter residents about different aspects of American life. And Seward Salisbury and his wife Ruth also hosted students in their home. They had a big old home on the west side of Oswego for the students.
Did they have a translator? I'm assuming they had a translator. So he was talking about.
Wait a minute, I missed that.
Sorry.
Translator.
Did they have a translator?
Yes, because he's talking about American culture and life,
Right.
and then to communicate with the refugees, I'm assuming they had to have someone translate.
Yes. Yeah, there were, yes. Although I have to say, they were all eager to learn English. And Paul showed you, there were a lot of volunteers who taught the adults English as well. But there were residents of the shelter who could speak English, yes. How that exactly worked, I'm not sure because, well, I wasn't around then, but, yeah.
The government provided like some translators for about 4, 5, 6 weeks, and they pulled them. Then the refugees, like Ann said, they formally had their own translators.
Is that? Yeah. So Marion Mahar, she taught at the college as well. Very interesting woman. She knew full well what the refugees had suffered at the hands of the Nazis because Marion Mahar actually lived and studied in Germany just prior to the outbreak of war. And as early as 1938, she spoke to students at the college about the dangers of Nazi party propaganda against the Jewish people. But she did something else. Once it was decided that the school-aged children in the shelter would attend Oswego schools, Marion Mahar organized and directed English classes for those youngsters to prepare them. So early on, there was this push to teach and to learn English. And she got a number of the city school teachers who volunteered to teach the classes. The college president at the time was Dr. Ralph Sweatman. His leadership allowed the college-age shelter students to thrive. And just one example, Shelter residents Eka and Rako Margulies had studied medicine in Yugoslavia before the outbreak of war forced them from their home and before they found themselves eventually in Fort Ontario and Oswego, New York. But the Margulies brothers, again, wrote later, crediting Ralph Sweatman and the college faculty for putting them back on solid academic footing. Both went on to attend Harvard Medical School. In fact, one graduated first in his class. I can't remember which one. But if anybody here has ever had a CT or a PET scan or another breakthrough radiological test, we can thank Rako Margulies because he ultimately led the team that developed that extraordinary advancement in medical imaging. And I like to say maybe we should thank Dr. Ralph Sweatman and his faculty as well. So Paul already talked about, we just kind of, generally talk to each other about this, but clearly we both see the importance of the newspaper editor, Edwin Waterbury, and what he did to try to quell rumors that inevitably would appear. And so I'm going to move along, but these are, actual samples of his columns. I also would like to add this because I think it's interesting in today's world. Eleanor Roosevelt actually talked with Edwin Waterbury when she visited the shelter in September of 1944, and he told her about this fiction fact about refugees column. And so when she went back, she wrote about it in her nationally syndicated My Day column, and she described how it worked, and she gave an example of a rumor and then how the facts were investigated, and as she said it, the real answer is given. But I loved her parting shot. She said, "I think rumor clinics in every town and village would help us to break the habit of repeating things which we're not really sure are true." And I'm like, can you imagine what Mrs. Roosevelt would feel about the world of social media today? Oh my goodness. The waitress, the factory worker, the machinist. Frances Ruggiero Enright and Jerry Dasons Rossiter were young women helping out their families, working at local jobs, as was Harold Clark, who was a machinist at the Fitzgibbons boiler plant. Fran, Jerry, and Harold gave the refugees what really is probably the best gift of all, the gift of their friendship. Jerry pushed her bike over the fort fence in those early days so that the kids in the shelter could have the simple pleasure of riding a bike again. Fran spoke to the young people at the fence in Italian and collected their signatures in her autograph book. And one of the young women Fran encountered, who actually came, she was orphaned, she came alone. Her name was Eva LaFane, and years later, she came back to visit the Safe Haven Museum. And the volunteer on duty that day was Fran Enright, Frances Ruggiero Enright. The two, of course, resumed their friendship and continued to correspond until Eva passed away a couple years ago. But Eva's family continues their correspondence and their friendship with Fran to this day. And in Harold Clark's case, he gave the young boys of the shelter the gift of Boy Scouting. He established the very first International Scout Troop. And what he did was he brought boys from his local troop to the fort to help organize the troop there and to work with the refugee boys. Again, young kids who could have never had this experience in war-torn Europe. The kids. Scouting was a very important activity for young people at that time, and one of the young scouts was shelter resident Branko Hochwald. Years later, Branko Hochwald, who had changed his name to Ray Harding, reflected on the shelter experience. It was, he said, an idyllic existence for children. Richard Rosenbaum lived in Oswego, and he was involved in scouting as well. As a teenager, Rosenbaum was able to secure a summer job at the fort shelter doing landscape work, not because he was old enough, but because he was tall and he lied about his age, but he got the job. But years later, Richard Rosenbaum recalled his first sight of the refugees when they entered the fort. He said, "I will never forget those families carrying their cardboard suitcases, exhausted, confused, frightened, half-starved, and their eyes haunted by past terrors." So one day, Richard's mother suggested to him that maybe he should bring his large collection of comic books over to the fort shelter for the young refugee kids. And Richard, being a dutiful teenager, did what his mother told him. And once he got there, he was literally surrounded by this crowd of youngsters eager to get their hands on these comic books. And there they are. Bronco Hockwald, now Ray Harding, moved to New York City with his parents once the shelter closed. He waited tables, drove cab, put himself through New York University Law School. Ray Harding eventually rose to become a very influential chairman of the New York State Liberal Party. Richard Rosenbaum eventually moved from Oswego to Rochester with his family. He went on to Cornell Law School, then entered local politics and rose to become Republican chair of Monroe County. He was also among the youngest to be elected state Supreme Court justice, but then later he left that position to chair the New York State Republican Party. And Ray Harding and Richard Rosenbaum were often called upon to represent their respective parties in debates at election time. At one of those events, they got talking about their respective backgrounds, and they discovered their Oswego connection. And Richard Rosenbaum asked Ray Harding, "Do you remember anything about your experience at the refugee shelter at Fort Ontario?" And Harding said, "Well, I was young then. I don't recall a lot." But he said, "The one thing I do remember was the day this older kid from Oswego came to the fort, and handed out all of his comic books. We were so excited." And Richard Rosenbaum looked at Ray Harding and smiled and said, "I was that kid." So in the months after the war ended, as Paul explained, there was a lot of renewed debate about the fate of the fort shelter residents. But I would say, while this was going on, to a large extent, Oswego citizens who had come to know the refugees as fellow human beings during their time at the fort really rose to the occasion. And they created a 5-page document that basically outlined a convincing argument to allow those refugees who chose to stay in the United States to do so. And it was signed by, you can see their signatures, but you can also see the typed list of who they were, by citizens from Oswego who represented a cross-section of the community. Another one of the boys in Harold Clark's scout troop was shelter resident Walter Greenberg. And in later years, Walter Greenberg reflected on the meaning of the Fort Ontario Emergency Refugee Shelter. And he said, "I think it's important to study what happened. Education. Not because of us 982 refugees, but more important historically, what happened to a country, and more specifically to a world which I believe engaged in world amnesia. I think so much was overlooked conveniently by good people. The bad guys," he said, "are easy to identify. The question is, what could the good guys have done to make it a little bit easier for more people to survive?" So when I began doing the research and then the writing of this book, I thought a lot about what would I have done had I lived during this time. I mean, would I have just ignored these people whose language and cultural barriers I couldn't or would not try to bridge? Would I have engaged in vocal opposition to these people? Or would I have reached out to lend a hand? I don't know what I would have done. But I certainly hope that I would have been like the Oswegonians whose stories are told in this book, the Oswegonians who signed this memorial document, who decided they were going to cross that barrier bridge of language and culture and who opened the door to their souls. And today, I, like all of you, I read, listen to the news, And these huge world problems, the attack on Israel, the refugee crises still around the world, even at our southern border, the alarming rise in anti-Semitism, these seem like such complex and insurmountable problems. And I think, how can I, one person, make a difference? But the lesson I take from Oswego and the many characters who are part of Oswego's story and whose stories are told in the book is that if I think first about the humanity that binds us all, I can make a difference in the life of another person. And more importantly, that person can make a difference in my life. That's a start. And that's not just a lesson for me or for Oswego. I think that's a lesson for the world. So again, thank you very much for your time, your attention. Along with Paul, I encourage you to visit Fort Ontario and the Safe Haven Museum, maybe when it warms up a little bit, but it's open now. And if I've piqued your interest and you want to learn more, this book is available. Actually, there's a, what is that thing? The QR code. I lost the, yeah, there's a QR code. For a link to it at our local bookstore, which is the Rivers End bookstore. I'm a big fan of independent bookstores. But, you know, if you feel as though Jeff Bezos still doesn't have enough money, it's available on Amazon. It's also available on Barnes & Noble, and we brought some with us today. So thank you very much.